The menagerie of ignorance of all observers is Zizek himself. Is Zizek simply defective by virtue of not having wrestled with historicism? The answer is yes, if historicism is rescued and begins to be the benefit of all the universe, or of all apeiron, which is to say, if historicism would be learned, then we would say anyone who didn't know of it and went on philosophizing without responding to it were in some way defective. So taking Zizek's view, which is manifestly an absolutist universalist view, I think it can come clear the radicality of the difficulty of historicism through an example which is basically in line with Zizek's own view, the atheist communist in the state of Tabasco, the Mexican state of Tabasco, called Tomas Canibal, who was the inspiration for the character in the Graham Greene novel, The Power and the Glory, where there's an exchange between the character that stands in for the cannibal character who was persecuting the Catholics in the 1930s in Mexico, whereby he comes into confrontation with the so-called whiskey priest, the one who has been hunting as a fugitive for quite some time. The argument runs there that Cannibal makes in the name of rationalism is that this suffering, which is sacred to the church, however that may be, is degrading. So we think of, and he says, people may want to be degraded in this way, but they must not be allowed to. And he makes an analogy with rape. He says people may want to or have the urge to rape, but they can't be allowed to. In the same way, people may want what Luther wanted, Leiden, Leiden, Kreuz, Kreuz, so suffering, suffering, the cross, dismissing the idea of happiness or the proper end of the human being as pleasure seeking rather than as some kind of infinite repentance towards grace. So taking that contrast, one can say it may well be that it's not cogent to us, really, the argument that people ought to be allowed to suffer, or maybe in some way they ought to be allowed to suffer, but then, and will claim that they can, but the whole society will be organized in order to put a stop to suffering. So I think so when Zizek says, for instance, something along the lines of someone's experience shouldn't be the measure. Someone experiences a cannibal as repulsive, let's say, for eating human flesh, but that's just their judgment at the time. Maybe it's wrong, That's just how they personally feel. But there should be some higher way to decide which is higher and lower. But then, what is he appealing to? How does he get to that appeal, and why? So why is it? Let's look at that through asking. So what's going wrong with the judgment of the person who says, let's say, who's the cannibal who says that cannibalism is fine because that's the society they're from and that's their experience. How does Zizek prove that something is wrong with that person? So is it on the basis of ignorance, so that if they had lived longer, if they had been taught better education, if they had been taught not to be cannibals, they wouldn't be? So ignorance, some positive reason, ignorance, like this is one. So say we have the category of error, and then the positive side. There's a positive side and a negative side. So actually, let's say that's the negative side, the ignorance. So like, for example, that I might park somewhere thinking I'm not going to get a ticket because I'm ignorant of the fact that it's not Sunday. I think it's Sunday, but it's not Sunday. I know there's no tickets on Sunday. I think it's Sunday. So it's just ignorance. But then uh, there's a positive side of that is somehow bad judgment due to um, some factor, such as interest is a big factor, that I have an interest in not knowing about something, that I convince myself, I reason somehow, in order to convince myself that even if the meter maid as the representative of the state would give me a ticket, I reason that in fact Sundays, uh, today is not actually Sunday, it's actually Tuesday, and um, I know that it's Tuesday because there was um, this has been decreed by a high authority on calendars, and their calendar says it's Tuesday. And I believe this is a more rational and more informed authority, and what the state is doing is wrong, and therefore, on the basis of civil disobedience, even if the state should give me that ticket on principle, I'll be right. And I'll take that all the way to the Supreme Court. Something like that. So we could delude ourselves with faulty reasoning, if that is faulty. How, from what ground can we say it's faulty? It's not immediately clear. Or and faulty reasoning in our interest in that case, because we want to get out of the ticket at bottom. Um, but what is Zizek appealing to when he says Martin Luther, who's for the Leiden, Leiden, Kreuz, Kreuz, suffering, the cross, and who isn't for forcing people to be happy, as it were. So, for instance, I see in the radicality of this break, for instance, when a character saw his brother committed double suicide with his fiancée, I believe it was, um, this was not viewed, however else it may have been viewed, as tragic in some sense. I'm not sure if tragic is inaccurate also, but it certainly wasn't viewed as mentally ill. So when we determine that suffering is bad, morally bad, it comes into this medical realm where medicine becomes moral, as we know this whole theme of diagnostic handbooks in the favor of controlling the norms, normative medicine, right? Moral medicine. So if you just determine that suffering is wrong and that suicide is wrong, then we can then diagnose people as mentally ill that suffer or have to do suicide, and this changes the inflection of what's happening within the Dasein of the society. That's very visible in the um, interjection of Western moralized psychiatric standards into Japan,